Good morning and welcome. As we complete the admin task of letting everyone into the meeting, I'd like to welcome you to our presentation on holiday entitlement and pay, focusing on the employer obligations and areas of risk. So holiday pay has become a much bigger and more questioned thing. So we felt it was appropriate to do a webinar, try and cover off some of the things that are relevant. It's quite tough, actually. It's one of the most complicated areas that we deal with. Pensions are complicated. Holiday pay is equally complicated. But hopefully we will shed some light on it. So if we go on to the first slide and we'll see where we're at. So first of all, a disclaimer. I've taken the disclaimer straight from the HMRC guidance because I figured if they don't have the definitive answers, then it's unlikely I would have definitive answers. So it's important to say that in the course of preparedness, I've scoured numerous sources, both our professional bodies, solicitors, employment lawyers, HMRC, of course. And ultimately, HMRC say it best when they say HMRC guidance does not provide definitive answers to all individual queries. It is not intended to be relied upon in any specific context or as a substitute for seeking advice, legal or otherwise, on a specific circumstance, as each case may be different. So that's in the most recent piece of guidance. Very rarely do you get actually definitive answers, but you get guidance and everything is based on that guidance. But just to make it clear, we deal with an awful lot of holiday stuff. We know a lot about it, but yeah, there's no substitute for specific advice in specific cases. So we will press on. So the agenda for today, a bit of background on holiday pay, leave types, the different types of leave that can apply, holiday entitlement itself, some broad some of the areas of holiday entitlement that you may or may not know. So I've looked at them and just brought them into focus again. The evolution of holiday pay, mainly through case law. So if we go back 15 years, let's say, the landscape was so very different to the way it is today. And that's because over time, case law has developed, people have taken actions, things have been fleshed out, and it continues to go on. The most recent changes were the 2024 reforms, and they were very much driven by a particular piece of case law, and they dealt with some of the issues that were apparent, but not all of the issues. So there are some that we would have hoped had been resolved, but weren't. We'll look at some calculations. So very dry, interesting subject, calculations. I'm sure everyone will be really excited by that, but it's just trying to put into some context what we're talking about, give a few simple examples in the hope of just laying some flesh on the bones, really. Then I've got a slide for our London Landmarks Half Marathon. We're doing a charity run, Bella and I, and when I did a presentation, I left the slide up for all of 15 seconds, not sufficient time for anyone to take a QR code. So I will linger on that one a little bit longer. There is no obligation, but I feel that I have to give everyone the opportunity because we're putting ourselves through hell. Well, not really, but that's the way I see it. And then any questions at the end, always welcome questions. So we'll press on to the first slide. So the first thing, regulatory landscape. I think it's fair to say that things have changed. The new government has obviously had a sharper focus on employment, employees' rights, protecting all aspects of employment. And one of the things that they're introducing very shortly is the Fair Work Agency, a new government executive agency under the Department for Business and Trade, and it's set to launch in April 2026, so not far off. And its purpose will be to enforce employment rights. The intention is it will unify existing bodies, such as HMRC's Minimum Wage Team, Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, and the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate. but its scope includes much of what we in payroll and you as employers deal with on a day-by-day basis. So things that we all are aware of, we all know about, but we're probably equally aware that HMRC are not particularly quick in picking up errors. So I think they're looking at it. I'm sure they will sell it as a, we want people to get it right, but there will always be stiff penalties attached to getting it wrong. So national minimum wage, constantly evolving. As the national minimum wage increases, then things that can go wrong are more likely to go wrong. Statutory sick pay, whole raft of changes in April, which are going to radically change the way statutory sick pay operates, because the waiting days are removed. What would be invisible now is going to become visible and, more importantly, payable. Employment agency regulations, modern slavery enforcement, which one would hope we don't have too much to do with, but holiday pay is listed as one of the areas of interest, which is very interesting because I think the only people who've really been interested in it in the past are employees and employers. So to have someone actually looking at the legislation and trying to apply it, which could be quite tough because it's very complicated. There are still grey areas. So, but I think, we had a hope that when the reforms in 2024 happened, we'd been engaged in working parties and consultations, and the hope was it would iron out some of the wrinkles within holiday pay guidance and legislation. It dealt with one facet, but it pretty much ignored one of the other ones, which I think, looking at the audience, is likely to be the one that causes more problems. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say it's going to be under the microscope more than it has been in the past, and so we need to be ready for it. So, background, if anyone doesn't know, holiday pay is based on the principle that a worker should not suffer financially for taking holiday. The whole aim of the exercise is that employees should be able to take holiday freely and without thinking about the financial consequences of taking it. In simple terms, almost all workers, except those who are actually genuinely self-employed, so not gig economy, which is, fallen under the legislation. But if you're generally self-employed, then you don't get holiday anyway, I don't think. But if you do, it wouldn't be covered. But everyone else is legally entitled to 5.6 weeks of paid holiday per year. And that's derived from the Working Time Regulations 1998. So it's 5.6 weeks. It's not 28 days. I apologize if I slip into 28 days. For a full-time worker, it will be 28 days, and it's so easy to slip between the two. But there are circumstances under which it's impossible to work 28 days, whereas it is perfectly feasible to work 5.6 weeks. So apologies in advance if I fall into that trap. I'll also fall into the trap of leave and holiday. But holiday and leave, they're the same. Sometimes they sound better in a sentence, and I've gone with one or the other. Consider them interchangeable. So the amount of pay a worker receives for holiday pay or holiday they take depends on the number of hours they work and how they're paid for those hours. So, as I say, the principle is that the pay received by a worker while they're on holiday should reflect what they would have earned if they'd been at work and actually working. Some recent changes. In April 2020, legislative changes came into effect as a result of the Taylor report, and a little pop-up has just popped up, so I just got to click it on my screen. But the Taylor report, one of the changes that came into being was the extension of the pay reference period from 12 weeks, which was a traditional time frame. It was used for lots of things. It was used potentially in sick pay calculations. It was used on lots of occasions. Following the Taylor report and the reforms or the changes in 2020, the pay reference period that you had to look at when considering and calculating holiday pay was extended from 12 weeks up to 52 weeks. And if you didn't have 52 weeks in which that employee had worked, then that could extend up to 104 weeks. So you are potentially looking at 104 weeks of pay data for every one of your employees every time they take a holiday. Now, that won't be necessary in all cases, but it will be necessary in some cases. And then we've had more recently, April as well, 1st of January 2024, but most of the changes actually were effective in April 2024. And I'll go into a bit more detail about those changes because they did frame some of the things that we all knew and worked with, and where assumptions had been made and people had over time decided to operate in a certain way. Some of those were enshrined in that guidance and those reforms. Some wasn't, but we'll look at that because it was quite important. It did iron out a few wrinkles, particularly with 0 hours workers. Right, next slide. Yeah, I ramble on. Holiday leave types. So there are different types of leave, and in a simple world where we'd love everything to be the same, they can potentially all be treated differently. You'll hear them described in different ways. I've described them as Euro leave stroke ordinary leave, which was derived from EU law. And that's 4 weeks entitlement, so 20 days for a full-time employee. And the rate of pay payable for that is normal remuneration. Nice and simple. What could be simpler? We all love something that's normal. Sounds very straightforward. We have domestic leave, which is basically what we invented in the UK as opposed to being under EU law. And that's the additional 1.6 weeks, which is often associated with bank stroke public holidays. People often talk about, I get 20 days holiday and I get bank holidays. And I'm always quick to correct them and say, you get 28 days, which may include bank holidays, but it may not. And those bank holidays, if they form part of that leave, all it really is your employer saying you will take that day. So it's not additional or extra, but it is treated differently, whatever the whys and wherefores, whatever you consider it to be. 1.6 weeks or 8 days for a full-time worker is and can be paid as basic pay. So we're not talking normal remuneration now, we're talking basic pay. And then many of you will work in organizations who go beyond that 28 days and offer enhanced leave or contractual leave. And that, like everything else in the contract, it goes beyond legislation. It should be in the contract. It should define exactly what it is and what it actually what's going to happen. So what is the entitlement? That's usually fairly straightforward. It might be 25 days plus 8 for bank holidays, or it may extend as your service with a business gets longer. As you reach service years, you may get more holiday. And the rate of pay for that also may or may not be defined in the contract of employment. But the reality is it can be dealt with differently. And in that case, it can be dealt with in the way you, the employer, see fit, because it is your offering. It's not a statutory obligation anymore. So you get to choose. More often than not, employers don't differentiate between these 3 types of leave, and everyone accepts and chooses to calculate and holiday pay using the normal remuneration rate. So we have very few clients, we do have very few clients who say, okay, I want you to treat 20 days in this way. I want you to treat 8 days in a different way. The reality is life is complicated enough when it comes to holiday pay. And the reality is that if you're treating the additional holiday in a more favorable way, then it's going to make the chances of falling foul or being taken to task over it is going to vastly reduce them. So I think everyone takes the low risk option. In terms of the order in which those leave types occur, although it's not enshrined in legislation, the accepted approach is that if you're dealing with different types in different ways, then the Euro leave is dealt with first, then the domestic leave, and then the contractual leave. But that's, as I say, there's absolutely nothing in law that says that is the way it is. It's just over time, it's become the way. So on to the next slide, please. Leave entitlement, just a few snippets on leave entitlement, what it is. So annual leave begins to build up as soon as a worker starts their job. So the minute you join a business, you'll get some entitlement to holiday pay. And if you're only there a day, you get more entitlement than you might feel that employee deserves. But the law is the law. It's not affected by other leaves, sickness, maternity, parental, or furlough. So just because you're off sick or you're on maternity leave, any accrual of leave, any entitlement will continue to grow and increase while you're on that type of leave. So a typical employee who comes back after maternity leave will have built up 9 months worth of holiday pay whilst they're on leave, which is what, 22-ish days, 21, 22 days. So you often find that someone doesn't return to work straight away. They take that before they return. If a worker starts their job part way through a leave year, they're entitled to part of their total annual leave for the current leave year. If an employee leaves part way through, so if an employee leaves, same is true. It's calculated on a pro rata basis. Unused holiday pay can be used as part of the notice period. So it's, you can say to an employee can finish on the 31st, and you say you've got 10 days holiday, you can finish early. That's absolutely fine. And if you give the right notice, then you can insist that that happens. You as an employer always have the right to choose your employee's holiday. So you can always ask an employee to take some holiday on a date of your choosing, provided you give the right notice to them. So this idea that it's all in the employee's hands, it's not. The employer, if an employee is building up holiday, not taking it, and your business can allow it to, can dispense with that employee for a week or two, then you're perfectly entitled to ask them to take it, or tell them to take it more accurately. Employers should ensure all employees take their statutory holiday entitlement. So when holiday entitlement was invented, it was a health and safety thing, really. It was to prevent people working too much. It was to ensure that people had the right holiday, the right breaks, to have some R&R time to leave the workplace. So the whole idea is that employees take holiday. So, there's an element you can carry over, but the bulk has to be taken. If you're providing contractual holiday pay, of course, then you can do what you like with it, to a degree. So you often see people selling holiday at the end of the holiday year, and that's fine if it's part of contractual holiday pay. Then that's not a problem. If, however, it is part of your statutory entitlement, then you can't sell it because you're obligated to take it. An employee can carry over unused holiday as set out by legislation. So that does change, but there are allowances you can carry over. It was extended during furlough because obviously people were taking lots of furlough. They weren't taking their holiday. But there's always options available to carry holiday forward. But there are always restrictions too. So you can't just carry 28 days into the next year, 56 days into the next year. That really doesn't cut it, and it won't work, and it's not allowed. So holiday pay and the evolution through case law. So if I go back to 2011, really, when the accepted wisdom was that if an employee was off, they were going to get their basic pay. If you were off as a salaried employee, even if you worked overtime, earned commission, earned bonuses that were performance related, you went on holiday, you get your salary. You wouldn't get any of those other bits and pieces. And that was accepted at the time. Of course, as with all things, people challenged that thinking and say, hang about, this isn't fair. In these circumstances, it's really not right. And they take their case to the appropriate body. They go through the courts, often ends up in the Supreme Court, and you end up with a case piece of case law that defines the way you will operate going forward. And all of these cases have a significant bearing on where we are today compared with where we were in 2011. So, as is always the case, because employees, if they're well done by, it's unlikely they'll take you to court, but if they feel hard done by, it's more likely. So what case law has done over time is extend the breadth and scope of holiday pay, brought more and more into the mix when you're calculating holiday pay. So it's just a brief overview there, Williams and others versus British Airways. So they were the first ones to challenge successfully that holiday pay entitlement should not be limited to basic pay. So it must correspond to normal remuneration. So these guys were pilots, and it was very specific at the time, but subsequently it's been built upon. We had Locke versus British Gas Trading, which is probably one of the most important ones, I would say, because it brought commission into the mix. Commission, it's a performance-related piece of pay, and it was previously excluded from any calculations, but Locke challenged that and was successful. And that one finally went through the Supreme Court, I think in 2018. I think the case began maybe 2014. So it was a long running case that the eyes of the HR and payroll world were on, constantly as it ping ponged between the appeal courts and eventually got to the Supreme Court. Air Scotland Limited versus Fulton. So that was all around payments being made for a sufficient period to qualify as normal. So there are lots of, we talk about normal, we talk about sufficient, we talk about irregular, regular, all these terms that are very difficult to define until someone says, okay, so you've given me the term, now I need to define it. It's like you can't play football on a pitch without any lines. So you need to define where you are in order to move forward. So that, put some flesh on the bones in terms of what was qualifying as normal. And then the one is probably the most significant one in recent terms, because it is what prompted all the 2024 reforms, was Harper Trust versus Brazil. And she was a music teacher. She was working term time. And the way pay was calculated was in line with the way almost everyone was doing it. And it was also, I think we in payroll look at fair and consistent application, and fair being very uppermost in our minds, really. You wouldn't knowingly do anything that was unfair. This was fair, depending on your perspective, of course, but it was broadly fair. But the problem with it was it wasn't lawful. The law wasn't in tune with perhaps what people might have considered to be fair. So what it has subsequently led to is clarification of the holiday pay for employees with irregular work patterns. And it has led to a whole new category of worker, which was previously not defined, the part-year worker, because, often in the academic sector, people are working part years. There are periods when they're working and there are periods where they're not working and not being paid. And it was the way that was applied that was problematic. So on to the next slide, please. So now where we are today, over time, pretty much every payment you make, it ends up being included in holiday pay, with one or two kind of exceptions, but we'll quickly run through it. I think it's kind of important. So commission is intrinsically linked to the performance of tasks under the worker's contract. And it needs to be based on average commission over a representative reference period. But the basic thing is that commission is performance based, and therefore it needs to be included in a week's holiday pay. If that employee is not going to be disadvantaged by taking that time off, because they're not going to earn commission. So in some way, it has to be made good. Overtime. So people talk about different types of overtime. It's not the name you give it. It's the way it, the way it is in your organization, really. So you can call it compulsory and guaranteed overtime. So, some businesses require an employee to do, their 40 hours contract plus maybe 5 hours on a Saturday, whatever it might be. You get non-guaranteed overtime, so that might be in line with business demand. It's there, not always, but you're expected to do it when it is. And voluntary overtime. And here's where we come back to so long as it is paid over a sufficient period of time on a regular and recurring basis. So what is sufficient? What is regular? What is recurring? Pay 1 hour a year, it's recurring. Is it regular? Is it sufficient? It is one of those. So that's where perhaps sometimes you wouldn't include it. Someone once in a blue moon does some overtime, you're very unlikely to include it in your holiday pay calculations. Bonuses, productivity bonus, if they're in any way linked to the performance of that individual, then they're going to be included in the holiday calculation. So if it's a productivity bonus, an attendance bonus, performance bonus, any of these things. The only one that is a grey area where care needs to be exercised to ensure that it's not going to be included are annual discretionary bonuses. They might be based on company performance. At the moment, they're very, far removed from the actual performance of that individual. Whether over time at some point someone's gonna, take a case and be successful, but the way that is framed, the way they're calculated, it is important to just make sure that they're not intrinsically linked to the performance of that individual or group of individuals, because if it's a group bonus, a team bonus, then it's still performance based. Then there's lots of other types of payments. I've listed a few there, but there are myriad different types of payments that people make. Standby payments, call-out payments, acting up supplements, tips and service charges. They weren't considered for a long time, but a piece of case law came along, and lo and behold, tips and service charges are now included in holiday pay calculations, even if they're in sitting outside the main payroll. So they're actually managed by a trunk master and they're in a separate PAYE scheme. They can still be considered for holiday pay. So holiday pay and entitlement reforms 1st of January 2024. So this is very important. It's the first time in a long time that a piece of case law has come to pass. And then the government or the Department for Trade and Industry has gone out and asked people for their views on the way things should be. So if I've done webinars on holiday pay before, and there have always been big, wide chasms of problem areas, principally around 0 hours workers. The calculations were so complex because you had a 0 hours worker. You're telling him he's got 5.6 weeks holiday. What does 5.6 weeks look like to that individual? They don't have a week's earnings, and therefore, how can they possibly relate that to the holiday they're likely to take and get paid for? It was nigh on impossible. So everyone had a solution that worked around the problem. You could bet your bottom dollar it wasn't going to be compliant, but there wasn't a compliant solution available. So the industry was engaged. The industry, talk about HR professionals, talk about employers, I talk about the big companies like Tesco and such like, and payroll professionals like ourselves through our charter body. We're all invited to engage and give our views on the way things should be. As a result of that, changes were made. And the reforms of January 2024 Firstly, they defined irregular hours workers and part-year workers in relation to the introduction of holiday entitlement accrual method and rolled up holiday pay. Wowee. So they invented a whole new category, part-year workers, to deal with those term time workers and the like. And they looked at accrual methods and rolled up holiday pay. Now, anyone who's been working in payroll, HR as an employer for more than 10 years is likely to have seen rolled up holiday pay rise and fall and rise and fall. I've seen it be the go-to solution as recommended by ACAS and HMRC for a period of time, and then I've seen it totally disappear and be expunged from their records, and for it to become totally unlawful and totally unreasonable. But now it's back and it's lawful and it actually is defined, which is kind of good news. It introduces a method to calculate statutory holiday entitlement for irregular hours and part-year workers. Hallelujah. One of the biggest problem areas for employers was if you had irregular stroke 0 hours workers. It was nigh on impossible. We've seen big organizations with many thousands of employees literally put people on a 10-hour contract so that they could calculate holiday pay, because on a 0 hours contract, as I said just now, it was nigh on impossible. Of course, now they've all got to go back and put them on 0 hours contracts because that was changed. And it's now easier to get your head around and calculate than it is for someone you've put on a 10-hour contract. But that was what happened. A couple of the big pub chains certainly did it. McDonald's did it. So there were plenty out there that took that approach. It introduces a method to work out how much leave an irregular hour or part-year worker has accrued when they take maternity or family-related leave or are off sick. So again, this was an area that was, I mean, what did you do? If someone was on maternity leave, how could you calculate their holiday pay? What allowances did you have to make for that scenario? Same with sick pay. Everyone would have done it in a fair and consistent way, I'm sure, but there was no actual guidance. So it was actually, you would make assumptions. You would say, okay, for that period of sickness, I'm going to assume that they were working the hours that they did for the 12 weeks prior to that, or whatever it might have been. What it did was set out exactly how you were going to do that. It maintains the current rates of holiday, where 4 weeks is paid at normal rate of pay and 1.6 weeks paid at basic rate of pay, whilst retaining the 2 distinct pots of leave. So that was something it didn't deal with, or as I've said, most people look at 5.6 weeks. It probably would have been nice if the whole, it had just been reframed so that the legislation applied to 5.6 weeks. No more guessing, no more artificial separation. If you did separate, no more possibility of getting it wrong. So I think it personally would have been nice if it had all been rolled into one place so you could deal with it together. The reality is everyone does that anyway, I guess. Defines what is considered normal remuneration in relation to the 4 weeks of statutory annual leave. So, as we've said, over time, many more types of pay have been rolled into the holiday pay calculation. And what it did was actually recognize and itemize some of those pay elements and say, these you are going to include it. So overtime was one. It had always been there. There was never any, ever since certainly 2018, it was always right to include it in the holiday calculations, but it was never there on paper. It was never in a set of guidelines, so it was open to interpretation and debate. Introduces rolled up holiday pay as an alternative method to calculate holiday pay it opened the door to do that, and it subsequently it also gave the mechanism by which that would happen. So that was the one really good piece of news, was that these 0 hours workers, these irregular hours workers, these part-year workers, you could apply logic, calculate based on facts, not assumptions, and it allowed you to be much clearer. Didn't all, I mean, it gives you a couple of options, and they're not great. They're, they have ups and downs, pros and cons. What it didn't do was simplify holiday pay calculations for workers with set weekly or monthly hours. So wouldn't it have been lovely if it had have dealt with those? The majority of, although irregular hours and 0 hours workers cause us more stress, the people who are on salaried but working those extra hours, overtime, they're on call outs, they're, doing, standing in for someone, responsibility payments, whatever it might be. That was not in any way dealt with. So we were left with the same position where we have to carry out complex calculations to get to an answer. If you've got complex calculations, there is always the possibility of it going wrong, especially if you're having to look at a minimum of 52 separate weeks and what happened in those separate weeks. It's not easy. So on to the next slide. So what did it help us do? So it defined the different types of worker. So we have 3 types of worker. There are workers with a set number of hours per week or month in a contract. So your typical salaried employee, Monday to Friday, paid X £1,000 a year. They come in 30 hours a week, 40 hours a week, whatever it might be. Their set number of hours. So they're entitled to a minimum of 5.6 weeks of annual leave entitlement. If they work more than their set hours, for example, by working overtime, it remains as per contract hours. So their entitlement is 5.6 weeks. Holiday pay is calculated as average pay, looking back 104 weeks to obtain a 52-week reference period. Yeah, okay. So that the problems lie in making the distinct, looking at in order to do an accurate calculation, you have to look at each week separately. The legislation talks about weeks. It does not talk about months. We had the same problems when we dealt with furlough and CJRS payments. It was all framed in weeks, and you then had to apply that to a monthly situation. Workers without a set number of hours per week or month in a contract, so an irregular hour worker, and workers who work part of the year, part-year worker, so their entitlements are the same to all intents and purposes. So for holiday years from the 1st of April 2024, so that was when this legislation, you could use it. Lots of people have been using it prior to that. Many people wouldn't have moved from it for 10 years. I can say with certainty, many people haven't moved away from it for 10 years because it came into vogue, out of vogue, and now it's back in vogue. They're entitled to 5.6 weeks of annual leave. That's 5.6 weeks maximum. If someone is a 6-day worker, 5.6 weeks, but it's a maximum of 28 days. So in the case of someone who is working 6 days a week, it's no longer 5.6 weeks. It'll be capped at 28 days. I don't think I've put it anywhere else in the presentation. It's quite important to mention it. Holiday years starting on or after 1st of April, holiday entitlement accrued per hour worked. So as you go, it's as pay as you go, really. It's you accrue entitlement as you go. So if you work an hour, you will have an associated entitlement with that hour. It'll be an hourly value, not a monetary value. And at some point, you will be paid it, either when you take holiday or via another route. And you're entitled to a prorated amount of 5.6 weeks annual leave entitlement per year. So the prorating works. So if you're a part-time worker, you prorate it. So it's not 28 days anymore. As I say, part-year workers and irregular hour workers, exactly the same in those terms. On to the next slide. What's included in holiday pay? So I'll take you through the case law, the way it's developed over time. 2024, January, it's there in black and white. And what is in black and white is payments, including commission payments, that are intrinsically linked to the performance of tasks which a worker is contractually obliged to carry out. So if that commission payment is performance related, it's based on what that employee does, and there aren't many commission payments that aren't. You generally pay commission based on performance. So they're in. Payments relating to professional or personal status relating to length of service, seniority, or professional qualifications. So that's the way it's defined. Therein. And other payments, such as overtime payments, which have been regularly paid to a worker in the 52 weeks preceding the calculation date. So we've still got a regularly in there. You know, I'm sure, well, there are cases always ongoing to firm up on what regular is. Regular, normal, they're just terms that have no place in what we do, really, because if you can't define them, you can't deal with them, really. So that was what was in the legislation, guidance. I talk about legislation. It's not legislation, it's guidance. It's the reforms. It's what the Department for Industry and Trade provided. So on to the next slide. So then we get into holiday pay calculations. How can I make this interesting? Nigh on impossible. So what we've got there, I'm just going to change my view. So we had some old favorites. When I last did a holiday pay webinar in 2020, we had some employees that this was Weekly Wilma. As it suggests, she's a weekly paid employee. And she earns £13.50 per hour. I can tell you in 2020, she didn't earn £13.50 an hour. She was nearer the national minimum wage at that time, but I've upped her rate of pay. Kind soul that I am. She started her contract in June, and I made it a part of a year, really, because I didn't want a spreadsheet that was going to show, or a table that was going to show 104 weeks. It would have taken up 4 or 5 slides, and there was no purpose to it. So she's joined in June, so she's been there for a while, long enough to validate a calculation, but not long enough to cause me to go into premature retirement or anything. So she's contracted to work 30 hours a week. Overtime is paid at time and a half, and she also receives commission based on sales. So I think the key here is this is one of those that if you look at her hours, her basic hours, she's contracted to work 30. She very rarely does work 30. She's one of those people who is contracted to a value and does something different. It's exactly what the two pub chains that I'm aware of did. They gave them a 10-hour contract. They were working 30 or 40 hours. It made no odds. It just meant they could define what a week was, so they could tell what 5.6 weeks looked like, and therefore they could measure the holiday as it went forward. But what it provides is just an indication that even this is a simple situation. It's a weekly paid worker who does a bit of overtime. But even in that simple situation, we're having to have tables of numbers. We're having to itemize pay elements. We're having to look at each week individually. We have to ascertain if there's any week in which 0 pay is received. So in week 7, no pay was received. And from a calculation point of view, that would be excluded from the 52 weeks if it was a 52-week period, and we'd have to look at 53. And there was another missing week in 18, so we'd have to go back to week 54, and so on and so forth. So it's really to illustrate that even in the simplest situation, and it's a situation that the reforms haven't addressed in any way, there's an awful lot of work and an awful lot of complicated calculations that need to go on to get to an answer. And so anyone that thinks it's simple, and everyone in the world today has software. We have payroll software, weirdly, that is designed to run payrolls. And it has myriad options within it that allow us to define parameters and measure holiday in various ways. But there's no way that we can measure weekly hours for a monthly paid individual. And so you're then sitting out, sitting outside the system with another system to try and capture all the data that's required. So it's really to illustrate that. In this case, the values are there. So she earned 12,600, yeah, £12,671.25. She was employed for 20 weeks, but we're only going to count 18 of those weeks. So if she takes a week of annual leave, then she's going to receive 1/18th of that total figure, which is 703.96, which is what you would expect. It's the type of figure she would have been paid if she had been there. If you'd have paid her 30 hours at basic pay, then clearly that wouldn't have been anywhere near the spirit or the principles which attach to holiday pay. So yeah, it's much more complicated than it should be, but it is what it is. On to the next one. Now I've revisited our case studies. Thankfully nothing's changed with these guys. So when we went back, we had fixed Fred, and he was a simplistic guy, 5 days a week, nothing complicated. And these were just designed to look at how you would calculate pay for a period of time, so a prorated part year calculation. So he works 5 days a week. He's entitled to 5.6 weeks of annual leave a year. He started on the 1st of January, and in this case, leave years run from the 1st of January to the 31st of December. So he was entitled to 3/12 of 5.6 weeks, which is 1.4 weeks, and 1.4 weeks, given his 5-day working week, is 7 days of leave. So he would be entitled to 7 days of annual leave at that point in time. And there's the calculation below. Compressed Colin, he was slightly different. So there's a real uplift in the number of people who compress their hours into a different working pattern. But you have to apply the same kind of logic to establish what their entitlement is. So Colin works a 30-hour weekly contract over 4 days. So he's working 9 hours on a Monday and a Wednesday, 6 hours on a Tuesday and a Thursday. So he's entitled to 5.6 times 4 days, 22.4 days statutory leave. But how many hours is that? Because his days are different. They look different every day. His average working day equals 30 hours over 4 days, equals 7.5 hours a day. So his holiday entitlement in hours is 22.4 days times 7.5 hours is 168 hours a year. And that's important in his case to have a measurement in hours because his days look different. So if you have people whose days look different, that's why we will often ask the question. Someone will tell us that we please pay 3 days holiday to a worker who is working strange working patterns. And we will go back and say, that's great, but we need to know how many hours he took or she took, because otherwise, the cute ones amongst them would be taking, they say, I've got 22.4 days and I'll have 22.4 days and I'll have 9-hour days. And you end up with an awful lot more holiday than you would have been entitled to. So you have to keep those records to make sure that that the right holiday is taken. And then finally, we had shift work Sharon. So Sharon works 4 shifts over 9 days. So hers is a little bit more complicated, but it still sits in that first category. So, the contract defines what she's going to do, when she's going to do it. So there's no irregular hours look to this. It's regular. It's just a different working pattern. So Sharon works 4 shifts over 9 days. She's entitled to 5.6 annual leave a year, weeks of annual leave a year, I should say. Average shifts per week are 4 over 9 times 7. So on average, she works 3.1 shifts per week. Annual leave entitlement is the lesser of 5.6. I don't know why I got the lesser. It's 5.6 times 3.1 shifts, which is 17 and a half shifts. That 28 shifts, I must have had a different, ignore that, is 17 and a half shifts. If you do the calculations, follow them through. I meant to take that off. I was a bit confused by it myself. So apologies for that. When the slides come out, if they come out, then I'll make sure that's corrected. And there's a calculation on the right-hand side, so you can see how that was derived. But yeah, different working patterns. You apply the 5.6 weeks in different ways, but ultimately it's 5.6 weeks. And you can convert it to an hourly figure if that suits your needs, which often it does. So on to the next slide. Okay, so now we get into our good friends, irregular or part-year workers. So this is where the landscape did change. And we now have alternative methodologies that we can apply. So the employer can choose how to pay irregular or part-year workers holiday pay. So the two alternatives are option 1. You can calculate 12.07% of the total hours worked per pay period. So each pay period, you would calculate 12.0% of the total hours worked in each pay period. You would then have an entitlement in hours that has been accrued. It's built up in a bank, a pot of money, a pot of hours. And then when that employee comes to take their annual leave, their holiday pay will be calculated as average pay, looking back over the last 104 weeks to obtain a 52-week reference period. So you've still got some calculations involved because, yes, you know what their pot is, but you don't know what that holiday looks like. You have to work out what that holiday looks like because they won't have a clear definition of a working day. The second alternative is calculate 12.0% of the total gross pay received per pay period and pay it to that employee within that pay period. This is what is known as rolled up holiday pay. I mean, if you have people who are doing low numbers of hours, working 5 hours on a Saturday, I mean, it's probably a very sensible approach to take. The disadvantage, so they must still take the leave though. You're not obligated as an employer from not allowing them to take that leave. But when they take it, they won't get paid for it because they've been paid as they go. But they must still have 5.6 weeks leave regardless. So on the right-hand side, I've kind of seen what I see as the advantages and disadvantages. There are more than that. I've been quite simplistic, I think. So with option 1, where you're accruing a pot of hours and that employee is taking them when they want to, it means that holiday is going to be paid when the holiday is taken. That employee who takes a week off is going to get something that looks like a week's pay when they take it. So they haven't got to do any fancy damn planning. They know what they're going to get. Well, they have an idea what they're going to get because it's always looking back at 52 weeks. What they get this week might be different to what they get next week. But it's paid when it's taken. So for some employees, that's right. It's going to be much easier to manage. It makes much more sense. Probably those who are, doing more hours and where, a missed week is going to be more problematic. Downside is complex calculations are still required. You're still looking at 104 weeks, 52 weeks up to 104 weeks. And there's a communication and management issue in terms of making sure that holiday is taken. So that's one of the downsides. With the rolled up holiday pay, the calculations are easier. What could be easier? You get to the end of the month, they've done 100 hours, you add 12.07 hours on top, you pay it. You itemize it on the payslip, of course. You wouldn't pay it as part of a lump. You would ensure that you have the underlying rate on there, and you have the rolled up holiday rate. It's important for transparency, it's clearly important for national minimum wage compliance. It keeps that rate of pay there visible front and center. And the timing of payments doesn't match the leave taken. So people cannot take leave and think they're going to get paid. And that's something that needs to be managed potentially. But you can almost point and shoot with it. Once you've communicated it and the workforce is clear that is what is going to happen, you don't get any more, how much holiday have I got left? Well, you do for the holiday they still need to take. But in terms of the holiday pay, you've kind of relinquished that burden. It's much easier for people to manage, and that's why it's been very much the chosen route for the last 10 years or so, even if it has been totally unlawful, because for some situations it's the only way you could work it. So yeah, so you've got some options, which which is good. You could choose some options for some of your workforce, another option for another part of your workforce. You're not tied to doing everything the same. It's much like other things, pensions and such. Like, you can match the solution that best suits the workforce that you've got, the demographic that you're dealing with. So on to the next. Irregular or part-year workers continued. Wow. So employees being paid rolled up holiday pay are still required to take leave, and it may require additional record keeping to evidence this. I mean, what form that takes is very much an HR task, I guess. I mean, certainly when it was first came into being, you would sit in a business, you would literally give an employee a shift so that they could take it as holiday to evidence the fact they were taking it off. The reality is they were never going to work it. You were almost you were just setting things in place to give it so you could take it away and replace it with holiday. All really pointless, but you might need to do that still. The other thing is 12.07% equates to 5.6 annual weeks annual leave. The percentages will change if your holiday entitlement changes. So if you offer more favorable terms, that percentage will be higher. The percentage you actually apply is as per the formula there. You take the number of weeks leave times 100. You then, is it the denominator on a fraction? The bottom part of the fraction. You take the 5.6 weeks from the 52 weeks to give you the number of weeks over which that leave needed to be earned, if you like. And that gives you 12.07%. So in that case, it's 52 minus 5.6, which is what, 48.4, is it? Or something like it. I haven't got my calc now. Anyway, that's the calculation. I should have put some stages in there, but I apologize, I didn't. So in the example, if someone has 25 days plus bank holidays, which is not uncommon, then they would have 33 days. That would be 6.6 weeks of annual leave. And so the calculation changes. It's now 6.6 times 100 over 52 minus 5.6. And in that case, the percentage would be 14.54%. So you can modify the percentage according to the number of days you're giving. So we've got some clients who give an extra day for anyone who's worked more than 2 years, more than 4 years, more than 6 years type of thing. So in that case, we use the percentage applicable to their holiday entitlement. So on to the next slide. I think is we've run out of slides. That's really good. I think. So this is my unashamed plea to support Bella and myself. We're doing the London Landmarks Half Marathon, supporting one of our charity clients, Lepra. We work with a lot of charity clients, and we've done a few things in the past. And anyone who wishes to ask us to do things to support them, we're always willing to listen, assuming we come back fully fit. So yeah, we've shied away really from raising money on behalf of charities because we didn't want to disappoint other charities we work with. But we've done these runs and we've run them for no point really, other than pleasure. So we thought if we could raise a few pounds in support of a charity, then we would do that. And last time I put this at the end of my presentation, I did say no obligation. I did say if you found the webinar useful, so that could instantly wipe out half the audience. But I would ask that you at least consider it. There is a QR code there. I didn't give anyone time to look at it last time, so I'm going to linger with this slide for just a moment or two longer. I put an example of how £25 might be spent. You don't have to give £25. I think every donation we've had so far has been £25. So it just happened to be, £10, £5, £15. Everything would be appreciated. Leprosy is something that I learned about in Sunday school back in the day. And you would have thought because it's curable, it would be consigned to history. But alas, it is not consigned to history. It's still a problem in many areas of the world. It's a neglected tropical disease which occurs in more than 120 countries with more than 200,000 cases reported each year. So it is a worthwhile cause in our view. The run takes place beginning of April. I hobble around the office, as does Bella, because we are getting a bit nearer now. It seemed like a great idea. Now it seems like a chore. But yeah, please consider supporting us. You won't get anything else. Well, I might send a QR code with the slide deck at some point, but yeah, please forgive me for being so unashamedly yeah, asking a question. But there we go. So that's that bit done. Upcoming webinars. If you haven't had enough of our webinars, I'm happy to say the next one's not me. So it's the team are looking to power up the new employer portal. So we've been using Brain for a long time now. There have been features that have been sat around waiting in the background, and we've had to iron out permission issues and things that we couldn't release it. So the team, it'd be Tracy, Megan, and Daniel between them who are putting this together, are very keen to show you some of the things that you can do, explore the portal a bit more, and yeah, hopefully educate you in that. And in April 2026, we were sat talking about, so I did it in my budget update webinar. I mentioned statutory sick pay changes and the fact they are significant because waiting days are disappearing. Average weekly earnings eligibility is disappearing. And much more SSP is likely to be payable because those odd days that currently don't get paid will, with the right documentation and following your internal procedures, they'll become payable. And there's quite a lot of information and control around that we'll need to put in place to make sure there's a smooth transition. We sort of talked it through and recognized there's more to this than meets the eye, isn't there always? So we're keen to, on April the 14th, share our findings, our brainstorms about how it would help us to help you to make sure that SSP is processed correctly. So that will be be an interesting one. I say that about all the webinars. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. So that's that. So that's me done. A big thank you to all of you who have sat through and listened. I am more than happy to take questions. They may be questions I can answer, they may not be, but I will happily give you my take or come back to you with an answer if I can't immediately answer it. It is a complex area, it is quite tricky. And as I've already said, if the guidance isn't specific or detailed enough to give the answer, then it may be that I can't. But I've done so much reading on this subject in the last 2 or 3 weeks that I would hope I know the answers. So